Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. So imagine you're just walking down the street on a Tuesday afternoon.
Right. Just a totally normal day.
Exactly. The sun is out, you've got a coffee in your hand, everything's perfectly fine. And then suddenly a delivery truck down the block hits this massive pothole and the exhaust backfires.
Oh, yeah. That loud, sharp pop.
Right. And, for you might jump, maybe spill a little coffee, kind of laugh it off with the person walking next to you. But for the person walking just like a few feet away from you, that sound doesn't just startle them.
No, it completely hijacks them.
Yeah. In a fraction of a second, their brain just dumps this massive toxic dose of adrenaline and cortisol into their bloodstream. I mean, their vision tunnels, their heart rate spikes to what, like 150 beats a minute?
Easily. It's an instant physiological cascade.
Right. And their mind is violently pulled out of that sunny Tuesday and thrown right back into a war zone or, a hospital room or some violent encounter they survived 10 years ago. They aren't just remembering it.
They're reliving it.
Yeah.
Actively, physically reliving it. And I mean, the physical reality of that moment is just staggering when you really look at it. The architecture of their brain is actively interpreting a completely safe, everyday environment as a lethal threat.
Wow.
And that biological response is so powerful and so deeply embedded in our survival circuits that conscious thought is essentially just taken offline.
Like the logical brain just shuts down.
Completely. We're talking about a fundamental restructuring of how a human being processes reality.
Okay, let's unpack this, because here's the strange paradox we find ourselves in today, right?
Yeah.
We are talking about a profound, life-altering neurological injury. And yet, if you open like any social media app right now or just listen to people chatting at a coffee shop, you'll hear the vocabulary of that exact injury applied to, well, almost everything.
Oh, everywhere. It's ubiquitous.
Right. A difficult meeting at work is, traumatizing. A friend who disagrees with you is gaslighting you.
Yeah.
A sad movie triggered you. It's like everyday English just absorbed an entire psychiatric manual overnight.
It really did.
Yeah.
The linguistic shift we've seen is undeniably massive. We've basically taken these highly specific clinical terms and generalized them to describe the normal, albeit painful, friction of everyday human existence.
Yeah. The words are everywhere, but the actual biological reality of what those words mean has been completely lost in translation, which is what we're going to dive into today for this deep dive.
I think it's so needed. Because while it feels like a victory for emotional awareness, and it is in some ways, diluting this language has, severe consequences.
How so?
Because understanding trauma isn't just about, gatekeeping a dictionary definition. It's about recognizing a distinct physiological condition that genuinely requires specialized medical intervention. When we lose the precision of the language, we lose the ability to accurately identify and treat the people who are suffering the most.
Right. So we're going to strip away the internet hyperbole today. We're stepping out of the comment sections, and we're going to look at the hard clinical, neurobiological, and historical science of psychological injury.
Let's do it.
We need to see what actually happens in the brain. So let's start right at the source. Before it meant, a bad date or a disappointing TV finale, what was the actual strict clinical threshold for the word trauma?
To find that baseline, we have to look at the diagnostic criteria used by psychiatrists. And a threshold is highly specific, and it's undeniably stark. Clinically, a traumatic event requires exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence.
Wow. Okay, so that immediately draws a massive line in the sand.
I tell you.
We aren't talking about feeling sad. We aren't talking about being insulted. We're talking about a fundamental threat to your existence.
Exactly.
So exactly how does someone have to be exposed to that threat for it to, count clinically?
Well, there are 4 recognized pathways. The first, and probably most obvious, is direct experience, like it happens directly to you.
Right.
The second is witnessing the event happen to someone else in person. The third involved learning that the event occurred to a close family member or a close friend. But in those cases, the event must have been violent or accidental.
Wait, so it doesn't count if, say, a grandparent passes away peacefully in their sleep?
Right, it doesn't, and that's an important distinction. Grief is profoundly painful, but it is a distinct neurological process from clinical trauma.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's the fourth pathway? I imagine there are people who are forced to deal with the aftermath of these things constantly.
Yeah, the fourth pathway is really critical for first responders, police officers, medical personnel. It involves experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events.
Oh, like police officers reviewing horrific evidence.
Exactly. Or paramedics arriving at catastrophic accident scenes day after day after day. That repeated extreme exposure absolutely meets the clinical threshold.
Man, that's heavy. So we have this very rigid, scientifically validated baseline. But when we look at contemporary English, the word trauma has been stretched like a rubber band.
Stretched to its absolute limit.
Yeah. It covers everything from that literal life or death baseline all the way down to having a tough conversation with your boss or experiencing a breakup. How did the rubber band stretch so far?
Well, it's a fascinating sociological phenomenon, really. The migration of these words began with a very noble intention, which was destigmatization.
Right, making it okay to talk about mental health.
Yes. Over the last couple of decades, there's been this massive push to talk openly. People began using clinical words to validate their emotional pain, to essentially say, my suffering matters. And, to a certain extent, it worked. We're way more aware of psychological distress than any generation before us.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If we are more aware and people are, more in touch with their feelings, isn't that inherently a good thing? Like if someone is completely devastated by a sudden breakup, who are we to say they aren't traumatized? Pain is subjective, right? Why should clinical psychology act like a bouncer at the club of human suffering?
It's a really vital question. It comes up a lot. But here's the thing. Nobody in the clinical field is suggesting that a devastating breakup or a job loss isn't profoundly painful.
Right.
Those experiences can absolutely shatter your world. They require support, empathy, sometimes professional therapy. The issue isn't about ranking pain or saying one person's suffering is irrelevant compared to another's.
So what is the issue then?
The issue is about mechanisms and treatments.
Mechanisms, meaning what is physically happening under the hood?
Yes. When we apply the word trauma to an experience that doesn't meet that clinical threshold for a threat to life or bodily integrity, we're being semantically loose, and that carries immense risk.
Because the brain reacts differently.
Exactly. Genuine threshold-meeting trauma produces measurable, distinct neurobiological alterations. It literally changes the physical structure and chemical baseline of the brain. If we use the exact same word for a difficult breakup as we do for surviving a war zone, we obscure the genuinely distinctive character of post-traumatic pathology.
It flattens the whole landscape. I guess it's almost like comparing a common cold to double pneumonia.
Oh, there's a perfect analogy.
Or like, a cold makes you feel miserable. You need rest, you need soup, you might miss a few days of work. But if you walk into an ER with a cold and demand the aggressive intravenous antibiotics they use for severe pneumonia, the doctors are going to stop you.
Right, because giving you pneumonia treatment won't fix your cold.
And it might actually destroy your gut flora and cause physical harm. Normal human distress, grief, disappointment, anxiety, that's the common cold of the human condition. It needs care, but it doesn't need specialized psychiatric interventions.
That maps perfectly onto the clinical reality.
Huh.
Pathologizing ordinary life difficulties is incredibly dangerous. It leads people to believe that normal distress is a medical crisis requiring clinical intervention rather than a natural part of human existence that can be navigated with social support and resilience.
Terminological promiscuity.
Exactly.
We're just handing out the heaviest words in the dictionary for everyday discomfort. So if we are claiming that genuine clinical trauma is fundamentally biologically distinct from a really bad day, we need to prove it. Let's look under the hood. What is physically happening in the brain when someone is subjected to that clinical threshold of threat?
Well, the neurobiological understanding of this has undergone an absolute revolution over the last 30 years. We've completely abandoned the outdated idea that trauma is just a bad memory someone needs to get over.
Thank goodness for that.
Right. Pioneers like Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, Bruce Perry, they've integrated developmental neuroscience and psychophysiology to show us that traumatic experience fundamentally alters the biological systems that regulate our survival.
It literally rewires the hardware. Okay, let's break that down piece by piece. Let's start with the alarm system.
Okay, so the brain's primary threat detection center is this small, almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe called the amygdala.
The amygdala, right.
Its job is to scan the environment for danger and initiate a survival response before your conscious logical brain even has time to process what's happening.
So in a healthy brain, it fires when there's an actual present danger.
Exactly. Like seeing a snake on a trail or a car swerving into your lane. But in a traumatized brain, the sheer overwhelming terror of the original event fundamentally alters the amygdala's calibration.
It changes the baseline.
Yes. You see a profound physiological sensitization. The threat detection threshold is lowered to the floor. So cues in the environment that are only vaguely, tangentially associated with the original trauma, like a certain smell, a tone of voice, a shadow, will trigger the amygdala to initiate a massive defensive physiological response.
Oh, wow. It's like a car alarm that's been set with the sensitivity cranked all the way up. Like it was designed to protect the car from someone breaking the window with a baseball bat. But because of a past break-in, the system is now so hypervigilant that a single leaf falling on the windshield sets off the sirens.
That is exactly what happens. The body thinks it's doing its job, but the calibration is completely destroyed.
So the poor person's nervous system is just blaring sirens all day long because the wind blew.
And the exhaustion that causes is unimaginable. While the amygdala is screaming that a lethal threat is present, it triggers the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands, to flood the body with cortisol and adrenaline.
Which makes the heart race.
Right. Blood rushes to the major muscle groups, the digestive system shuts down, the body is preparing to fight to the death or run for its life.
But they are just like standing in a grocery store aisle, and the logical part of the brain can't just step in and say, hey, we're in a grocery store, calm down.
It can't. The logical part of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, is actively suppressed during this cascade. When the amygdala takes over, the brain basically decides that thinking is a luxury you cannot afford right now. You just need to react.
Wow.
And this leads us to the second crucial brain structure involved in this biological collapse, the hippocampus.
Okay, the hippocampus. This is the part of the brain that handles memory, right?
It is. It's central to forming coherent, contextualized autobiographical memories. The hippocampus is the mechanism that takes your daily experiences and files them away in a chronological narrative. It stamps a memory with a time and a place, telling your brain, this happened yesterday at this specific location, and now it is over.
So it's like the filing clerk of the brain, stamping the date, putting it in a folder, putting the folder in the cabinet.
Perfect analogy. But during an event of extreme traumatic stress, that massive flood of cortisol we just talked about does something very specific. It suppresses the functioning of the hippocampus. Cortisol in extremely high doses is actually toxic to hippocampal neurons.
Wait, really? So the filing clerk is basically suffocated by stress hormones right as the most important life-altering documents are coming across the desk?
Exactly. The system completely breaks down. Because of this cortisol-mediated suppression, traumatic memories are not filed away normally. They don't get stamped with a time or a place. They lack the contextual narrative structure of your everyday memories.
So they don't feel like memories?
No. If I ask you what you had for breakfast yesterday, you remember it as a story. You see yourself in your kitchen. You know it was in the past. Traumatic memories do not work like that.
Because the clerk was unconscious, the files just blew all over the floor.
They present as fragmentary sensory and emotional intrusions. And this is the biological mechanism behind a flashback.
Oh, wow.
The memory comes back not as a story, but as a disjointed fragment of sensory data. A sudden racing heartbeat, the smell of burning rubber, a flash of a specific color. And because the hippocampus never stamped it with a date, the brain does not know it is in the past.
The amygdala thinks it's happening right now.
Exactly, in the present tense.
That is absolutely terrifying. You aren't remembering an event, you are biologically time traveling back to it.
You really are.
And this explains why you can't just tell someone to get over it. The physical machinery required to put the event in the past literally failed to operate during the trauma. But if the hippocampus dropped the ball and the memory isn't stored neatly in a folder, where does all that terror go?
That brings us to Bessel van der Kolk's landmark concept. The body keeps the score.
What does that actually mean mechanically?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it points to the somatic dimension of trauma. Because the cognitive brain failed to integrate the experience, the traumatic event is stored as actual physical patterns of bodily tension and physiological reactivity. The threat response gets trapped in the nervous system.
So the trauma literally lives in the muscles.
It lives in the muscle fascia, it lives in the vagus nerve, it dictates the baseline tension of the entire body. Clinicians observe chronic postural collapse, shoulders perpetually hunched as if preparing for a blow. They observe severe breathing restrictions, where the diaphragm remains chronically tight, keeping the body in a state of shallow, hyperalert respiration. The sensory systems just remain in a state of hyperreactivity long after the event.
The body remembers what the mind is desperately trying to forget.
Precisely.
And if that tension is locked into the physical nervous system, that poses a massive problem for traditional talk therapy, doesn't it? Like, if my car alarm is blaring, I can't just sit in the driver's seat and logically talk the car into calming down. I have to pop the hood and physically reset the electrical wiring.
That is the major clinical implication of this somatic understanding. Purely cognitive, top-down talk therapy, where you just sit on a couch and discuss how you feel, might be totally insufficient if it doesn't address the bottom-up somatic reality.
Right, because the body is still screwed.
Exactly. If you talk about the event, but your vagus nerve is still signaling that you are under attack and your diaphragm is braced for impact, the healing will be incomplete. The evidence for this bodily dimension of trauma storage has grown so substantial, it's transforming how we approach treatment entirely.
So we have this vivid, terrifying biological reality. A hypersensitized amygdala, a suppressed hippocampus, and a body locked in chronic physical terror. This clearly isn't just severe anxiety. This is a distinct mechanical failure of the human survival system. When did the medical community finally wake up and realize they needed a completely separate category for this? How did we get the diagnosis of PTSD?
Well, the history of PTSD is not a story of quiet, sterile laboratory discovery. It is a history forged in intense social conflict and political advocacy.
Really?
Yes. Post-traumatic stress disorder as a formal diagnostic category did not exist until 1980.
1980.
Yep, 1980. That's when it was introduced into the third edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-3.
That is incredibly recent. What were they calling it before then? I mean, we've had wars and atrocities for all of human history.
Historically, the psychiatric establishment used a rotating door of terms, and most of them were dismissive or actively pathologizing the individual. During World War I, it was shell shock. During World War II, it was combat fatigue or gross stress reaction.
Right.
But by the time the DSM-2 was published in 1968, the category for trauma-specific reactions was actually removed entirely.
Wait, removed during the height of the Vietnam War?
Yes. The psychiatric establishment at the time was heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory, which often looked for internal neuroses or childhood conflicts to explain adult distress. So when Vietnam veterans returned home and presented with horrific nightmares, severe emotional numbing, and explosive rage, the medical establishment often diagnosed them with pre-existing character flaws, or schizophrenia, or standard depression.
You're kidding.
No. They were essentially told, the war didn't break you, you were already broken, or you're just failing to adjust.
I can't even fathom the level of betrayal those veterans must have felt. They survive unimaginable combat. Their nervous systems are completely hijacked, and the doctors tell them it's a character flaw.
It was devastating. And that betrayal catalyzed a movement. The creation of PTSD was largely driven by the fierce advocacy of Vietnam veterans, working alongside anti-war psychiatrists like Jim Shaitan and Robert J. Lifton.
Oh, wow.
They organized rap groups, these informal therapy sessions, where veterans realized their symptoms were incredibly consistent across the board. They gathered the clinical data, they marched, they protested. They essentially forced the psychiatric establishment to acknowledge that an external event of sufficient horror could fundamentally shatter a healthy human mind.
So the diagnosis wasn't just a medical label, it was a societal vindication. It was a formal acknowledgement that said, what happened to you broke your biology, and it is not your fault.
Beautifully put, yes.
So when they finally codified it in the DSM-3, how did they define the fingerprints of this condition? If I am a clinician in 1980, what am I looking for?
They categorized the phenomenology of PTSD into 4 distinct symptom clusters. And to get the diagnosis, you have to show symptoms in all 4 areas.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first cluster is intrusion. This connects directly to our discussion about the hippocampus. Intrusion involves the involuntary re-experiencing of the traumatic event.
Right, the fragmented files blowing around.
Yeah.
So this looks like nightmares, flashbacks, and a severe physiological reaction if you encounter a trigger. the memory aggressively invading the present.
Exactly. The second cluster is avoidance.
Which makes total logical sense. If my brain is constantly forcing me to relive the worst moment of my life every time I hear a loud noise or go to a certain neighborhood, I am going to radically alter my behavior to avoid those triggers. I'd stop going outside, I isolate myself.
And that isolation leads right into the third cluster, negative alterations in cognition and mood. This is a profound, pervasive shift in how the person views themselves and the world.
Well, yeah. If you're hiding from the world because it feels infinitely dangerous, your mood is going to crater.
But it goes deeper than just feeling sad. It involves a persistent, distorted sense of blame. The person might genuinely believe they caused the trauma or that they are permanently damaged.
No, man.
You see this terrifying emotional numbing and inability to experience joy, love, or connection. They feel profoundly detached and estranged from the rest of humanity.
It sounds like being trapped behind an invisible wall while everyone else just goes about their lives.
It really is. And the final cluster.
Yeah, what's the fourth?
Alterations in arousal and reactivity. This is the amygdala stuck in overdrive. It manifests as severe hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, chronic sleep disturbance, irritability, and sometimes reckless or self-destructive behavior.
The nervous system just burning itself out on high alert.
Exactly. When you combine those four clusters, intrusion, avoidance, negative cognition, and hyperarousal, you have a coherent, observable syndrome that perfectly mirrors the neurobiological breakdown we explored.
Okay, so that framework covers classic PTSD. And you can see how that maps perfectly onto a discrete acute trauma. You know, a car crash, an earthquake, a combat firefight. There's a before the event and an after the event.
Right.
But human cruelty is rarely that tidy. What happens when the trauma isn't a single event, but a chronic, inescapable reality? What happens when a child grows up in a house where the threat is their own parent? Because the diagnostic manual didn't just freeze in 1980.
No, it evolved, but I have to say it took a shockingly long time to recognize chronic trauma. This brings us to the concept of complex PTSD, or CPTSD.
I've been hearing that term a lot more lately.
Yes. The seminal work on this was published by psychiatrist Dr. Judith Herman in her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery. She observed that patients who had endured prolonged, repeated, or developmental trauma things, like severe childhood physical and sexual abuse, long-term domestic violence, human trafficking, or being a POW, they presented with a symptom profile that standard PTSD just couldn't capture.
1992. And how long did it take for the medical establishment to officially recognize CPTSD as a distinct diagnosis?
It was finally incorporated into the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11, in 2022.
2022. 30 years. 30 years of advocacy to recognize that chronic trauma leaves a different fingerprint than acute trauma.
It's astounding, isn't it?
It really is. So what does that fingerprint look like? How does CPTSD differ from standard PTSD?
Well, complex PTSD includes all four of the core symptom clusters of standard PTSD: the intrusion, the avoidance, the hyperarousal. But it adds three profound, distinct additional dimensions that reflect the damage done to a person's developing personality and relational capacity.
Okay, what's the first added dimension?
First, severe difficulties in emotional regulation.
Meaning, the baseline ability to soothe yourself is broken.
The emotional thermostat is shattered.
Yeah.
Individuals experience massive, uncontrollable waves of anger, despair, or suicidal ideation that they simply cannot downregulate.
And the second dimension?
The second dimension involves profound disturbances in self-perception, and this goes far beyond low self-esteem.
What does it look like in practice?
It is a persistent, crushing core belief of fundamental worthlessness. They carry a toxic, debilitating shame, deeply believing they are permanently ruined, contaminated, or just fundamentally different from other human beings.
That's heartbreaking. And the third dimension?
The third is severe disruption in relational functioning.
Which makes brutal logical sense. If an earthquake destroys your house, you develop classic PTSD. You're terrified of the ground shaking, but you can still trust the paramedics who pull you out of the rubble. You can still trust humanity.
Right.
But if the people who are biologically supposed to love, feed, and protect you were the ones hurting you every single day for 10 years, your entire map of how human beings operate is corrupted at the root level.
The capacity for trust is obliterated. People with CPTSD have immense difficulty feeling safe in any interpersonal context. They often oscillate between complete isolation and desperate, unstable attachments. Herman's vital contribution was identifying that this chronic interpersonal trauma requires a fundamentally different therapeutic approach.
Yeah.
You aren't just trying to help them process a single bad memory, you're trying to help them reconstruct a viable sense of self and a capacity to trust another human being from the ground up.
Now, this connects directly back to the biology of the hippocampus we talked about. We established that during severe stress, the hippocampus shuts down. Memories aren't filed chronologically. They become messy, fragmented intrusions.
Yes.
So if we are talking about complex PTSD, we are often talking about children. If a child's brain is subjected to horrific, chronic abuse, their hippocampus is constantly suffocated by cortisol. Their memory of their own childhood isn't going to be a clean chronological timeline.
Exactly.
There are going to be massive gaps, missing files, terrifying fragments. And this specific biological reality sets the stage for what is arguably the most explosive, controversial, and tragic chapter in the history of psychology.
Oh, absolutely. The recovered memory controversy of the 1980s and 1990s, it was one of the most acrimonious, bitter scientific and legal wars in the field's history. It pitted clinicians against experimental researchers, tore families apart, and had massive societal consequences.
It was a full-blown culture war. Let's look at the two armies on the battlefield here. Who was holding the line in the first camp?
The first camp championed the recovered memory position. This camp was populated largely by clinicians and therapists who worked directly with survivors of severe childhood trauma. Figures like Lenore Terre and Christine Courtois.
And what were they arguing?
Based on their clinical work, they argued that when a child faces inescapable, horrific abuse, the mind engages a profound survival mechanism, dissociation and repression.
The brain basically says, if I stay conscious for this, I will lose my mind, so I am going to hide this information in a vault where I can't access it, so I can go to school the next day and pretend everything is normal.
That is exactly the theory. They believed the mind walls off the traumatic memory from conscious awareness. And furthermore, they argued that in adulthood, often through intensive psychotherapy, these repressed memories could be recovered.
And once recovered, they thought these memories were perfectly accurate.
Yes, they believed that once uncovered, they were reliable, accurate, historical accounts of actual events.
So the vault exists, the therapist has the combination, and the documents inside are perfectly preserved.
Okay. What was the opposing camp?
The opposing camp held the false memory position. This was championed by experimental cognitive psychologists, most famously Dr. Elizabeth Loftus.
Right, Loftus. She's a legend in this space.
She is. And Loftus didn't operate in a therapy clinic. She operated in rigorous empirical laboratory settings, studying how human memory actually functions. Her decades of extensively replicated research prove that human autobiographical memory is not like a video camera recording reality on a hard drive. Memory is reconstructive. Reconstructive, meaning every time I remember my 10th birthday party, I am not playing a video. I'm actively rebuilding the event in my mind from scratch.
Exactly. And because you are rebuilding it every time, memory is highly malleable, deeply fallible, and incredibly susceptible to suggestion.
Right.
Loftus conducted a series of landmark experiments, perhaps most famously the Lost in the Mall study.
Walk us through exactly how she did that. How do you prove memory is fake?
It's brilliant. Her team recruited participants and contacted their families to gather 3 true childhood stories about the participant. Then, the researchers constructed a 4th, entirely fabricated story, that the participant had been lost in a specific shopping mall at age 5, was terrified, and was eventually rescued by an elderly person.
Okay, totally made up.
Totally made up. The researchers gave the participants a booklet containing the 4 stories, told them they were all true, and asked them to write down any details they remembered.
And what happened? Did people actually fall for it?
Well, initially, most people said they didn't remember the mall incident. But over a series of follow-up interviews, researchers applied subtle, suggestive pressure. They would ask things like, "Are you sure you don't remember the old woman? Try to picture them all."
Just a little nudge.
And remarkably, about 25% of the participants not only began to remember the entirely fake event, but they actively started generating their own rich sensory details to flesh out the story.
Wait, really?
Yes. They remembered the color of the old woman's coat. They remembered crying by a specific store. Loftus proved that through suggestive questioning and the pressure to remember, you can implant highly compelling, detailed false memories of events that never occurred.
Man, that is wild. And this is where the tragedy of the polarization hits like a freight train, right? You have these two sides, and they're both wielding undeniably valid, scientifically grounded insights. But instead of sitting down at a table and synthesizing the data, they go to war.
It was a disaster.
Because on one hand, Loftus's research is bulletproof. You absolutely can implant false memories. If a therapist is using hypnosis or relentlessly suggesting to a vulnerable patient, "I think you were abused, keep digging," they can accidentally construct a completely fictional, horrific memory.
That is the profound danger of suggestive therapeutic practices.
But on the other hand, the clinical reality is that childhood abuse is a horrific, widespread epidemic. It is massively underreported, and survivors absolutely do experience genuine discontinuities in their memory because, as we now know from the neurobiology, their hippocampus was drowning in cortisol.
Exactly. Their filing system is legitimately broken.
Right, so their memory is going to have holes.
And that failure to synthesize those two realities caused immeasurable damage. The controversy devolved into a binary adversarial bloodbath. The legal system, which requires a binary guilty or innocent, and clinicians dealing with incredibly fragile human minds were caught in the crossfire.
So you had innocent people going to jail.
Yes. You had innocent people falsely accused and sent to prison based on memories that were inadvertently synthesized in suggestive therapy. And simultaneously, you had genuine survivors of horrific, verifiable abuse who were dismissed, mocked, and told they were just delusional or manipulated by their therapists.
It's a dark, shameful chapter. Both sides used their truth to completely obliterate the other side's truth. So where are we now? When the smoke finally cleared, what is the contemporary scientific consensus on recovered memories?
The contemporary synthesis is, thankfully, deeply nuanced and heavily grounded in the neurobiology of the hippocampus. The consensus holds that both phenomena are entirely possible and real.
Okay.
Because memory is reconstructive, the field now recognizes that corroborating external evidence is vitally important when historical or legal claims are being made based on a recovered memory.
And what about the therapy room? Are therapists still using hypnosis to dig for trauma?
The clinical guidelines have shifted radically. We now know that specific, aggressive therapeutic practices, hypnosis, age regression therapies, guided imagery focused on suspected abuse, or leading questioning, massively increase the risk of false memory formation. Ethical trauma therapy today is strictly non-leading.
But they do acknowledge that genuine trauma can emerge later in life, right? How do you tell the difference between a real memory breaking through and a false memory being constructed?
This is the crucial discriminator.
Yeah.
Genuine trauma memories, when they do emerge after a period of being unavailable, almost always present as fragmentary intrusive recall.
Ah, the flashbacks we talked about.
Yes, they present as those biological flashbacks, a sudden physical terror, a disjointed sensory flash, a physiological panic attack without a clear narrative context. This is fundamentally distinct from the highly coherent, detailed, chronological biographical narratives that often emerged in false memory cases developed through suggestive therapy.
So a real traumatic memory feels like a biological explosion, not a neatly written chapter of a book. It is amazing how much suffering could have been avoided if the mechanics of the hippocampus had been fully understood and integrated back in the 80s.
Absolutely.
Now, having spent so much time discussing how trauma affects children, both in terms of abuse and how their memory functions, we have to expand our scope. We've looked at the microscopic biology, we've looked at the therapy room, but what happens when we zoom out and look at the entire population? What is the broader epidemiological impact of childhood adversity?
Zooming out brings us to one of the most monumental pieces of public health research ever conducted, the ACE study.
The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
Yes. This was a massive epidemiological investigation conducted by Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anlanda at Kaiser Permanente in collaboration with the CDC in the late 1990s. And the origin story of this study is fascinating because they weren't originally looking for trauma at all.
Right. Dr. Felitti was running an obesity clinic, wasn't he?
He was. A highly successful medical fasting program for severe obesity. His patients were losing massive amounts of weight, sometimes over 100 pounds. But Felitti noticed a baffling, tragic pattern.
What was it?
A significant percentage of his most successful patients, the ones losing the most weight, were suddenly dropping out of the program and rapidly, intentionally regaining the weight.
Wait, why would you intentionally regain the weight after working so hard to lose it?
Felitti couldn't figure it out either, so he started conducting deep, qualitative interviews with these patients. And what he uncovered was profound. Many of these patients, particularly women, revealed that as they lost weight and their bodies became smaller and more conventionally attractive, They started receiving unwanted attention.
Oh.
And that attention felt profoundly unsafe because a massive percentage of these patients had histories of severe childhood sexual abuse. Overeating and maintaining a larger body size was not a lack of willpower. It was a deeply ingrained, unconscious, physiological defense mechanism.
The weight was literal armor.
The weight was literal armor.
That is a staggering realization. The behavior that the medical field was treating as the problem was actually the patient's solution to a trauma no one had ever asked them about.
Exactly. And this revelation completely shifted Filletti's paradigm. He realized that adult physical health issues might be deeply rooted in hidden childhood trauma. So he and Dr. Anda designed the ACE questionnaire. They surveyed over 17,000 middle-class, mostly white, employed adults receiving healthcare at Kaiser Permanente.
What exactly were they asking them? What constitutes an adverse childhood experience?
They categorized adversity into 10 distinct categories. This included direct abuse, so physical, emotional, or sexual, direct neglect, physical or emotional, and various forms of severe household dysfunction.
What counts as household dysfunction?
Things like witnessing a mother being treated violently, living with a household member who had a substance abuse issue, untreated mental illness in the home, having an incarcerated household member, or parental separation and divorce.
So they survey 17,000 people. What did the data show that was so revolutionary?
Well, first, they discovered that adverse childhood experiences are incredibly, startlingly common, even in a middle-class, insured population. But the truly revolutionary finding was the documentation of a powerful dose-response relationship between a person's ACE score, so the number of adversity categories they experienced, and their health outcomes decades later as an adult.
Meaning, the higher the dose of trauma, the worse the response in the adult body.
The correlation was staggering. The higher the ACE score, the exponentially higher the risk for a massive array of adult health issues. We aren't just talking about psychological issues like depression, anxiety, or alcoholism. Those risks skyrocketed. We are talking about leading causes of physical death. A high ATE score dramatically increased the risk for cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, chronic lung disease, cancer, and premature death.
Okay, we have to stop here and really look at this because the implications are wild. We are saying that an emotional, psychological experience of neglect or abuse at age 6 directly correlates to a physical heart attack or a cancer diagnosis at age 50. How is that physically, mechanically possible? I understand how a terrible childhood leads to adult depression, but how does it lead to blocked arteries?
To understand that physical bridge, we have to look at the work of child psychiatrist Dr. Bruce Perry and his neurosequential model of therapeutics. Perry's work emphasizes a fundamental reality of human development. A child's brain is not just a miniature adult brain. It is actively, rapidly developing, building billions of synaptic connections, and it develops in a use-dependent fashion.
Use-dependent. So the brain builds the pathways it uses the most and prunes away the ones it doesn't need.
Yes. The brain's primary job is to adapt the organism to its specific environment. So early adversity literally shapes the structural development of the brain's stress response systems and the prefrontal regulatory networks. If a child's early environment is characterized by chronic threat, chaos, domestic violence, or a lack of safe attachment, that child's developing brain does something incredibly intelligent and adaptive. It calibrates their entire nervous system for a dangerous world.
It assumes the world is a war zone, so it builds a soldier.
It builds a brain that is permanently hypervigilant, highly reactive to stress, quick to anger, and deeply distrustful. Because in that chaotic childhood home, being hyper-reactive is a life-saving adaptation. If you can hear your father's angry footsteps on the porch before he even opens the door, you can hide. Your hypervigilance keeps you alive.
But the tragedy unfolds when that child grows up and leaves that violent home.
Exactly. That newly wired nervous system is a catastrophic misfit for safer adult environments. They're walking around a grocery store in peacetime, but their body is permanently locked in a physiological state of war.
And that chronic state of war is what destroys the body. It's the endless drip of stress hormones.
It is chronic toxic stress. If your HPA axis is constantly dumping cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream day after day, year after year, it causes massive systemic inflammation. It causes immense wear and tear on the inner lining of your blood vessels, leading to atherosclerosis and heart disease. It suppresses your immune system, making you more vulnerable to cancer. The physical diseases captured in the ACE study are the end-stage result of decades of biological wear and tear caused by a nervous system that was forced to adapt to terror in childhood.
That bridges the gap between psychology and cardiology right there. But the data actually takes that a step further, doesn't it? Because it's not just the wear and tear of stress hormones eroding the organs. There is an actual molecular bridge between these childhood experiences and the physical architecture of the adult body. And that brings us to the frontier of epigenetics.
Epigenetics provides the most profound microscopic explanation for the ACE study's findings. For a long time, we viewed our DNA as a fixed, unchangeable blueprint. You get your genes from your parents, and that's the script your body reads from. Right, you're stuck with it. But epigenetics has shown us that our environment and our experiences can actually change how our genes are expressed without changing the underlying genetic code itself.
So the DNA sequence doesn't mutate, but the way the body reads the manual changes. How does an experience literally turn a gene on or off?
The mechanism involves chemical tags, most notably a process called DNA methylation. Think of your DNA as a massive, intricate piano keyboard. The keys, your genes, are fixed, but methylation is like placing a heavy piece of tape over certain keys, physically preventing them from being played.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Severe chronic childhood adversity produces specific methylation changes in the genes that control the body's stress response.
So the trauma literally physically alters the piano keys, regulating the HPA axis.
It alters the methylation patterns of the glucocorticoid receptor genes, which regulate how the brain responds to cortisol. So the childhood experience reaches down into the molecular level, attaches a chemical tag to the DNA, and permanently alters how that individual's body will handle stress for the rest of their life.
It reshapes biology at the most fundamental level.
This is the ultimate convergence between the psychological experience of trauma and the hard molecular science of human biology. And as we'll explore shortly, there's emerging, highly debated evidence that these epigenetic tags, these pieces of tape on the piano keys, might actually be transmissible across generations.
We are definitely going to dive into that transgenerational aspect because the idea that trauma can be inherited is mind-blowing. But first, let's take a collective breath here.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Because if you are listening to this and you are realizing your own ACE score is high, this can feel like an incredibly daunting, deterministic reality. We just outlined that trauma lowers the amygdala threshold, suffocates the hippocampus, traps physical tension in the vagus nerve, shatters a child's relational map, causes heart disease decades later, and literally alters gene expression.
It sounds incredibly bleak.
Right. If trauma reshapes our nervous system and our molecular biology that profoundly, are we just doomed? How on earth do we fix hardware that is fundamentally broken?
It is heavy, but this is actually where the science offers the most profound hope. The treatment of PTSD has one of the strongest, most rigorously validated evidence bases in all of clinical psychology.
Oh, really?
Yes. When we look at the broader landscape of general talk therapy, the data can sometimes be a bit thin or highly contested. But for trauma, we have specific, targeted interventions that have demonstrated consistent, powerful efficacy in randomized controlled trials across incredibly diverse populations. We know how to rewire the hardware.
Okay, that is a massive relief. So what actually works? When you walk into a clinic, what does the evidence support?
The gold standard, with the most extensive and robust empirical backing, is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT. Within that umbrella, the most prominent variants are prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy.
Let's break down prolonged exposure. How does that actually look in a room with a therapist, and how does it mechanically fix the broken hippocampus?
Prolonged exposure operates on a highly specific mechanism: systematic, graduated exposure to traumatic memory and its associated reminders, but conducted within a profoundly safe, controlled, therapeutic context.
Which directly challenges the second symptom cluster of PTSD, avoidance.
Exactly. People with PTSD organize their entire lives around avoiding the memory because the amygdala is telling them that remembering the event is as dangerous as experiencing the event.
The alarm is blaring.
Right. But by avoiding the memory, the brain never gets the opportunity to learn that the memory is no longer a current threat. The avoidance reinforces the fear. Prolonged exposure deliberately disrupts that cycle.
So the therapist essentially asks a patient to stop running, turn around, and look directly at the monster. What does that actually sound like in a session?
The therapist guides the patient to recount the traumatic narrative out loud, in the present tense, repeatedly. They track the patient's anxiety levels, their subjective units of distress, as they speak.
I imagine the anxiety spikes massively at first.
It does. Initially, it spikes massively. But as they recount the story over and over in a safe, quiet room with a supportive clinician, a biological process called habituation occurs. The conditioned fear response begins to extinguish. The amygdala stops firing the alarm.
But hold on, if we established earlier that the hippocampus couldn't process the memory chronologically during the actual event because it was drowning in toxic levels of cortisol, is exposure therapy essentially just forcing the brain to do the administrative paperwork it physically couldn't do the first time around?
That is precisely the biological mechanism at play. By bringing those raw, terrifying, fragmented sensory files back up into conscious awareness in a completely safe environment where cortisol levels are manageable and the prefrontal cortex is online, the hippocampus can finally do its job.
Wow.
It takes those fragmented sensory details, files them into a coherent autobiographical narrative, and permanently stamps them with a date and time. The cognitive processing locates the memory securely in the past. It tells the amygdala, this was a horrific thing that happened then, it is not happening now.
That is incredible. It is literally repairing the filing system. What about EMDR? I feel like you can't talk about trauma therapy today without hearing about EMDR. That's the therapy with the eye movements, correct?
Yes, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s. In an EMDR session, the patient focuses on a distressing traumatic memory while simultaneously engaging in bilateral sensory stimulation.
What does that look like?
Most commonly, this involves visually tracking the therapist's finger moving rapidly back and forth across their field of vision, though it can also involve alternating audio tones or physical tapping.
It sounds almost like hypnosis. Does it actually work, or is it a placebo?
Oh, the clinical outcome data is very clear. EMDR is highly effective. It has massive institutional backing. It is recommended in the clinical treatment guidelines of the World Health Organization, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, the American Psychiatric Association, the VA. It helps people process trauma rapidly.
Okay, so it works.
However, within the scientific community, there is a fierce ongoing mechanistic controversy regarding why it works.
What is the debate?
The debate centers on the eye movements. Many researchers argue that the bilateral stimulation, the finger tracking, has absolutely no unique neurobiological effect. They argue that EMDR works simply because it is a form of exposure therapy. You are forcing the patient to confront the traumatic memory in a safe context, just like in TFCBT.
So the critics say the eye movement is just a gimmick to distract the patient while the exposure does the real work.
Essentially, yes. This is known as the working memory taxation theory.
Working memory taxation.
The idea is that your working memory has a limited capacity. If you are forcing your brain to track a moving finger, you don't have enough cognitive bandwidth left over to experience the full, overwhelming terror of the memory.
Oh, that makes sense.
The bilateral stimulation simply distracts the brain just enough to allow the patient to tolerate the exposure without panicking, allowing the hippocampus to process the files. So the field agrees it works, but they heavily debate the underlying neurological mechanism.
Well, regardless of the debate, if it helps the patient file the memory away, it is a vital tool. But earlier, we talked heavily about Bessel van der Kolk and the somatic storage of trauma. We established that trauma lives in the muscle fascia, the vagus nerve, and the posture. If a patient does prolonged exposure or EMDR, does that cognitive processing automatically release the physical tension trapped in the body?
That specific question is driving a massive rise in the popularity of somatic approaches to trauma therapy. While cognitive processing is vital, many clinicians argue it is insufficient for patients whose trauma is deeply embedded in their physiology.
Right, the body is still keeping the score.
Exactly. This is where we see the application of Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, Pat Ogden's sensoromotor psychotherapy, and body-based interventions grounded in Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, like trauma-sensitive yoga.
How do those differ from sitting on a couch and talking?
They focus directly on the bodily dimension of the trauma response. Instead of starting with the cognitive narrative, they start with the nervous system. They work on tracking physical sensations, releasing trapped physiological arousal, completing defensive movements that were thwarted during the original trauma, and regulating the vagus nerve through breath and posture.
So it's bottom up instead of top down.
Exactly. They aim to reach the frozen nervous system that top-down cognitive therapy might bypass entirely.
And what does the empirical evidence say about these body-based therapies?
The rigorous randomized controlled trial evidence base is currently smaller and more limited than the decades of data we have for TFCBT and EMDR. However, the data is growing rapidly, and their theoretical grounding in the neuroscience of embodied memory is highly coherent.
So a combined approach is best.
Clinically, yes. Many trauma specialists are finding that the most comprehensive way to heal severe trauma is a combination approach. Top-down cognitive processing to organize the narrative, and bottom-up somatic regulation to calm the physiological nervous system.
So we have built a powerful, evidence-based toolkit for helping the individual in the clinic. We can rewire the amygdala, process the memory, and release the tension. But we touched briefly on epigenetics earlier, the idea that the impact of trauma might physically alter gene expression and cross generations.
Yes, transgenerational transmission.
Which means we need to radically expand our scope once again. We need to move from healing the individual to examining what happens when entire demographics, entire populations require healing. Let's delve into the complex, highly debated world of collective and historical trauma.
This represents a profound expansion in how the psychological sciences conceptualize injury. We are moving the lens from the individual clinical experience to the collective communal experience over time. The terms used here are historical trauma, cultural trauma, and transgenerational trauma. These concepts are deeply illuminating for understanding societal pain, but they also require immense conceptual caution and scientific rigor.
Let's start with the origin. Where did the framework of historical trauma come from?
The theory was most prominently developed and articulated by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in the 1990s, specifically grounded in her work with Native American communities.
Okay.
Her foundational theory proposed that the cumulative multi-generational trauma of colonization, forced relocation, the boarding school era, cultural destruction, and systemic genocide produces a very specific, devastating psychological profile within a community.
A massive communal wound that doesn't just heal when the immediate violence stops.
And crucially, Braveheart argued that this trauma persists and compounds across generations. It is transmitted through a complex web of psychological, social, cultural, and, as we explored with epigenetics, potentially biological mechanisms. The descendants carry the psychological burden of atrocities they did not personally experience.
Let's drill into the exact mechanisms of that transmission, because this has been studied extensively in other populations as well, correct?
Yes, the transgenerational transmission of trauma has been heavily researched in the descendants of Holocaust survivors, the descendants of formerly enslaved people, and descendants of victims of severe famines, like the Dutch hunger winter.
And what does the science actually say?
The scientific evidence for this transmission is a fascinating, highly complex mixture of robust clinical findings and immense, almost insurmountable methodological challenges.
What kind of robust findings are we talking about? How do you measure trauma in someone who wasn't there?
One of the leading researchers in this specific area is Dr. Rachel Yehuda. She conducted groundbreaking studies examining the biological cortisol profiles of the adult children of Holocaust survivors. Remember, these are individuals who were born after the war. They did not experience the Holocaust themselves.
And what did she find?
Yehuda found that these children exhibited altered HPA axis functioning. Specifically, they had lower baseline cortisol levels and a heightened sensitivity to glucocorticoids, which distinguished them from control groups.
Their physical stress response systems were biologically different, mirroring the exact adaptations we see in trauma survivors themselves.
Yes. Their biology seemed to reflect an adaptation to an extreme threat environment that they themselves had never lived in.
That is staggering. The trauma of the parents is literally written into the biological baseline of the children.
Yeah.
But you mentioned massive methodological challenges. If the cortisol levels are verifiably different, what is the complication?
The immense central difficulty in human research is separating psychological transmission from biological epigenetic transmission. It is the ultimate entanglement of nature versus nurture.
Break that down. Why is it so hard to separate?
Well, if a child has an altered stress response, is it because they inherited an altered epigenetic marker, a piece of tape on the DNA directly passed down through the parental gametes from the traumatized parent?
Right.
Or is it simply because growing up in a house with a parent who has severe, untreated combat-level PTSD profoundly affects your childhood development?
We go right back to the ACE study.
Exactly. If your parent is chronically hypervigilant, easily terrified, emotionally numb, or prone to explosive anger due to their own trauma, your childhood environment is chaotic and stressful. And we know definitively from Bruce Perry in the ACE study that a stressful childhood environment alters the development of a child's HPA axis.
So is the child's biology altered before birth via DNA methylation, or is it altered after birth by the psychological environment of the home.
That's the million-dollar question.
It could be the DNA, or it could just be the heartbreaking reality of being raised by someone who is terrified all the time, or, most likely, an incredibly complex, reinforcing mixture of both.
Precisely the scientific consensus. The specific molecular mechanisms of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in humans remain heavily debated and uncertain. Even though the core observable phenomenon, that massive, unhealed parental trauma casts a long, measurable shadow over the offspring, is substantially established.
But there are immense risks here when we zoom out this far, aren't there? If we start applying clinical diagnostic terms like trauma to entire demographics or generations of people, we have to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush.
The risks of conceptual overreach are significant. When you apply the language of individual clinical trauma to collective historical experiences, you risk pathologizing entire communities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You risk defining a whole culture or an entire demographic group primarily by its wounds and deficits rather than its profound resilience, culture, and strength.
Which is incredibly limiting.
Furthermore, there's a severe risk of reducing incredibly complex ongoing historical and political processes like systemic racism, economic disenfranchisement, or the legacy of colonialism to a psychological injury.
Which implies that the solution is psychological. You end up trying to solve a systemic political problem with a therapist.
And that is the danger. It risks substituting therapeutic frameworks for political ones. If a community is suffering from the ongoing legacy of historical injustice, structural inequality, and present-day discrimination, the primary appropriate response is political action, systemic policy change, economic investment, and justice. Not just providing mass group therapy and diagnosing the community with a psychological condition.
Right.
Now, highlighting these risks absolutely does not invalidate the profound concept of historical trauma. The communal pain and the transgenerational effects are real. But it requires that we apply the concept with immense precision, being crystal clear about what specifically is being claimed and through what specific mechanisms the effects are operating.
I think that distinction is vital for how we view society. It is the fundamental difference between diagnosing a broken societal system that needs reform and diagnosing a broken person who needs psychiatric care. Both need fixing, but you use entirely different tools. And this massive, sweeping expansion of the concept of trauma, starting from the single acute event in a combat zone, expanding to the chronic reality of childhood adversity, zooming out to the historical wounds of entire communities, and finally, cascading all the way down into our text messages and social media feeds, brings us right back to our starting point today, the language we use every single day.
It does. The vocabulary of psychological injury in the English language has expanded and shifted so substantially and at such a rapid pace over the past 2 decades.
It's dizzying.
And this semantic shift is a reflection of 2 parallel phenomena: a genuine, wonderful growth in our public scientific knowledge, and the broader, messier cultural process where highly specific clinical concepts get absorbed, digested, and often distorted in everyday lay discourse.
It is exactly like a massive societal game of telephone. We started with very specific, heavy words anchored in neurobiology, and by the time they are passed through 100 million social media accounts, they mean something else entirely.
Yes, completely altered.
Let's look at a few of these specific words that have migrated. We hear trigger, gaslighting, narcissistic abuse, dissociation, hypervigilance. These all moved from the specialist psychiatric clinic to standard, educated, lay discourse. How much precision did they actually lose in transit?
They lost a highly variable, often complete degree of precision. Let's take the word trigger, which is perhaps the most ubiquitous. In a clinical neurobiological context, as we discussed, a trigger is a specific conditioned stimulus that produces an involuntary re-experiencing of traumatic material.
Right, the fragmented memory intruding.
It initiates a severe physiological fight-or-flight cascade, an amygdala hijacking, and sensory flashbacks. It is an uncontrollable, terrifying neurological event.
But in contemporary colloquial English,
triggered has been watered down to mean being significantly upset, annoyed, offended, or made uncomfortable by a topic of conversation or a situation.
Right. I'm triggered by my coworker chewing their food loudly, or that article about the election triggered me. It just means I didn't like it.
Or take the term gaslighting.
Yeah.
Clinically, And originally originating from the 1944 film Gaslight, it refers to a severe, calculated form of psychological manipulation where an abuser, systematically over a long period of time, tries to make a victim question their own memory, their own perception of reality, and their fundamental sanity in order to control them. It is a form of profound psychological abuse.
But colloquially?
Colloquially, people now use gaslighting to describe someone simply lying to them or even just stubbornly disagreeing with their version of a past event during an argument.
So as a listener, as someone who just speaks English in the modern world, scrolling online and talking to friends, why does navigating this semantic drift actually matter? We touched on it at the beginning, but let's fully synthesize it now that we understand the biology. Why shouldn't we just let language evolve?
It matters profoundly because language shapes our reality. The words we use construct the framework through which we understand human behavior. The professional navigating an office, the empathetic friend supporting a loved one, the informed citizen. We all must be able to navigate the vast chasm between these colloquial uses and their technical biological meanings.
Because if we don't...
When you recognize that a term is being used loosely to describe normal distress, you avoid overreacting, pathologizing a normal conflict, or misinterpreting a standard social situation as a medical crisis.
Right.
And conversely, and far more importantly, when someone is truly suffering from clinical trauma, when their amygdala is permanently hijacked and their hippocampus is broken, using precise language allows you to grasp the sheer severity of their experience.
You can actually see them.
Yes. You are better equipped to communicate clearly about psychological states, to advocate for the exact right kind of evidence-based help, and to interpret the world around you with accurate empathy.
It really comes down to a matter of profound respect. Protecting the clinical definitions of these words isn't about being a grammar snob or a psychological gatekeeper trying to tell people their pain doesn't matter. It is a matter of respect for the people who are suffering from genuine, debilitating neurological injuries.
Absolutely.
If we dilute the word trauma until it simply means everything in life that feels bad, we abandon the people who desperately need that specific word to explain why their brain is literally on fire.
I completely agree with that assessment. Precision in our language fosters true, effective empathy. It ensures we use the right tools for the right job. It allows us to honor both the natural resilience of the human spirit in the face of ordinary, painful distress and the profound, specialized need for healing in the face of genuine biological trauma.
What an immense, incredible journey this has been today. We have traveled all the way from the microscopic neurobiology of a threatened amygdala and a suffocated hippocampus through the political battlegrounds of the DSM-RA and the recovered memory controversy.
It's a vast landscape.
We've looked at the lifelong physiological impacts of adverse childhood experiences on the human heart and explored the profound hope found in evidence-based treatments like prolonged exposure that can literally rewire the brain. We zoomed out to see the sweeping societal impacts of historical adversity and brought it all the way back to the words we type on our phones.
We really covered it all.
Through it all, the recurring, undeniable theme is this. True clinical trauma physically rewires the body and the mind, and it requires specialized, evidence-based care.
And returning to the reality of our everyday lives, it reminds us that while our language will inevitably continue to evolve, holding on to the core scientific and biological truths behind these words allows us to be sharper listeners, more supportive friends, and vastly better advocates for public health.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've explored today. Think about this massive migration of language. We've seen how deeply clinical words for severe psychological injury keep getting absorbed by colloquial English to describe everyday distress.